Okay, my clock says 1 o'clock, and so we are going to start the webinar. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Janine Creighton, and I'm the associate or the administrative director for the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. And we are excited to partner and co-host this webinar today with the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network. For those of you not familiar, the Northwest and the Southern Rockies are two of the 15 fire science exchange networks across the country that are funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. So not only does Joint Fire Science fund research, they also fund the science delivery. And part of our mission is to disseminate regionally relevant information to our stakeholders. And we try to do this by offering a diversity of opportunities for people to participate. And hosting webinars is just one of the ways that we accomplish that. So before we begin, to avoid any noise interference, your audios have all been muted. So if you have any questions, please type those questions into the chat box. And I will be recording this webinar, and it will be archived on our website and YouTube channel, as well as on the Southern Rockies website. And you can find those web addresses in the chat window as well. So first of all, we'll just do some quick introductions. First, I would like to introduce Gloria Edwards. Gloria is a friend of mine and is the coordinator for the Southern Rockies Fire Science Exchange Network. And she will be moderating the question and answer portion of this webinar at the end. But on to our speakers. First, is Courtney Schultz. She's an associate professor of forest and natural resource policy at Colorado State University and director of the Public Lands Policy Group. Her recent work has focused on policy innovations to support collaborative landscape restoration, effective fire management, and climate change adaptation on U.S. forest lands. Also, our speakers is Heidi Huber-Stearns. She's an assistant research professor and director of the Institute for Sustainable Environment at University of Oregon. She works on natural resource policy, mainly in the Western U.S. She is also the associate director of the Ecosystem Workforce Program, which is a bi-institutional program of University of Oregon's Institute for Sustainable Environment and the College of Forestry at Oregon State University. The Ecosystem Workforce Program conducts applied social science research and extension services at the interface of people and natural resources. And also joining us is Anna Santos. She is part of the University of Oregon Prescribed Fire Project team and is a faculty research assistant at the Ecosystem Workforce Program at University of Oregon. And with that, Courtney and Heidi, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Janine. I'm going to go ahead and get us started today, everybody. And then Heidi's going to take over about halfway through. This is a presentation on a project that we've been working on since 2017 on policy barriers and opportunities around prescribed fire. This is a Joint Fire Science Program project, and I want to just thank so many of you for taking an interest in our work and also participating in our work as interviewees and also helping us share findings and providing us feedback. It's been an awesome project to work on. So this is, I'll get a little bit more into this, but this is the second stage of our work where we are looking at case studies of specific locations that are doing more prescribed fire in the West. And that's what we'll be talking about today. I just want to make sure I acknowledge my colleagues, Heidi and Anna, who are on the phone, and also Sarah McCaffrey has been working on this project with us as well over the last couple of years. And thanks to the Fire Science Consortium and Network for hosting us. So just to give you a quick overview of the project, we all know that there's a lot of literature indicating really the importance of prescribed fire for forest restoration and that we're not really getting much more on the ground. And so we know that we're not really increasing accomplishments on federal lands and in a significant way across the West. This is also something that came up in our research on the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program that we completed last year, and people told us that they were doing good work, but really having a hard time meeting their prescribed fire goals. And of course, there's variability based on location, but I think this is an overall trend that most of us are aware of and really working to overcome. And so in 2016, the Joint Fire Science Program put out a call to identify policy barriers based on perceptions in the field and help identify opportunities and mechanisms for overcoming them. At the time when we were writing that proposal, we looked at the existing literature and we realized that there hadn't been really comprehensive work done across major regions, like across the whole West for quite a while, but past surveys had indicated, those were from data from the 1990s, had indicated that NEPA and air quality permitting and sometimes the Endangered Species Act issues were significant barriers to practice. And so what we wanted to do was figure out if that was all still true and where it might be true and how that might differ across states in the West. But we also, as policy scholars, recognized that we wanted to understand if the challenges were really in the law or if maybe they were in regulation or agency policy. And kind of doing that investigative work from a policy perspective really helps us understand, where the actual mechanisms and opportunities for change might be. So that's kind of the overall emphasis of our work, is to identify those barriers, but then also real opportunities for moving things forward. Our work on this project is a 4-year project, has several stages. We completed a legal analysis of all of the state implementation plans, and you can find that on the University of Oregon website that's down here in tiny font in the bottom right corner, and I'll put that up again later. And then phase 1 of our work was that we did interviews across the Western states. So we talked to about 6 people in each state, and that was including state forestry agencies, key partners, BLM and Forest Service, and then air quality regulators. And so with that work, we were trying to get a big picture perspective of what was going on across the West and what were the general trends. These 2 papers I put up here are where that work is really documented. And so the one on the right is really written for just a general audience. It's not, doesn't have a big lit review built in there, and I think is really digestible. So I'd point you to that if you haven't seen it, and it's on my website, and also again, this University of Oregon website at the bottom where we're housing a lot of our documents. And then on the left is the paper that came out this year in International Journal of Wildland Fire, based on that work as well. So that's kind of where we're at right now. We also have a geographer that's working with us on a spatial analysis that we will hope to have out next year as well. Just to recap some findings from phase 1, if you haven't heard me talk about this before, we heard from people across the West that the biggest challenges they were facing with doing prescribed fire were lack of funding and capacity. They said that they had major challenges with capacity in terms of staffing burn teams, having people available when it was time to burn, when they were in prescription. People said they were also having challenges with capacity to, primarily to get through clearances. And they talked a lot about the criticality of effective resource sharing. So they said in order to get all the equipment and the people that they needed to burn, they had to get pretty creative with resource sharing across agencies, sometimes through handshake agreements, but people talked a lot about the importance of efficient agreement mechanisms, and those being some of their biggest challenges. We also heard a lot about limited incentives to do prescribed fire and the importance of leadership. People basically said, where there's a will, there's a way, and where there's not a will, there's a lot of things you can point to that sort of might get in the way of an effective prescribed fire program. And there just aren't a lot of rewards or incentives for doing it. So people talked a lot about the importance of leadership at, regional, state, down more to local levels, and individual fire management officers, and those people being critical to making sure work actually happens. We also heard a lot about the importance of collaboration and communication. And so a huge thing that I think came out of our phase 1 work was that people said collaboration at the state level was really important, particularly to get state land and air quality managers talking and working together, coordinating burners, and making sure there was really open dialogue between land managers and air quality managers. And so that importance of that state level collaboration, in addition to all the local collaboration and partnerships, really came out loud and clear in the first phase of our work. And then we heard a lot about the importance of communication with the public and with partners and making sure people are on the same page. There wasn't anything in our initial phase of work about that really indicated there's a need for federal policy change at this time. People kind of anticipated there might be eventually, but that's not something that came out loud and clear. We did hear that there might be a need for more flexibility, particularly around air quality permitting in specific locations. For example, in the Pacific Northwest, we heard that state implementation plans were more restrictive and that was more of a challenge there. But again, not so much an issue where people were saying we need to change the Clean Air Act or change NEPA. It was much more locally specific stuff that we heard about. So that's a recap of a lot of stuff that we went through. And again, I'd be happy to talk with folks about it or check out those publications I mentioned. I want to move on to what we're going to talk about today, which is this case study work that we're doing. And so our goal here was to find a few places that people in our initial phase of interviews said would be interesting places to look, that we're getting more fire on the ground, and using some unique approaches that maybe could serve as exemplars to other units. And so we chose these 4 cases, and we're going to talk about each of them today, and we'll tell you a little bit about why we chose them. And of course, there'll be more information about that in our report, and we could share that with you. The goals and general methods for this phase of our work were to look a little bit more closely at the local level and see if the findings we had from across the West were holding true locally. You know, we were wondering, you know, when we talk to like local FMOs and district rangers, are we going to hear the same thing about challenges, or are we going to hear some different dynamics? Because our first phase was more kind of broad brush, more at the state level. And then we really wanted to see on these units where people said, you know, go check out what the San Juan or the Sierra is doing. We wanted to know what is it that they're doing that people think might be creative and useful examples for other units. We did interviews with district FMOs, supervisory staff, staff officers, line officers, partners, and this involved, you know, in-person week-long field visits to each of these locations from our team, and then follow-up interviews. We're doing qualitative semi-structured interviews, and that's because we want to be able to really get in depth on these issues and find out how people are overcoming challenges. We're finishing up our analysis now, and we'll have a report out likely in February. We'll make sure that we let you know all about that when it comes out. So I'm going to transition into talking about a couple, or our case studies, and I will talk about the first 2 and then hand this off to Heidi to talk about the second 2. I'm going to start with the San Juan National Forest. This was the first case that we did. Sarah McCaffrey and I had the wonderful fortune of spending time down there in early fall of 2018. And the reason we went to the San Juan was because people in Colorado, Region 2 of the Forest Service in particular, said this was a place with a really active program. They thought they were using a lot of really valuable strategies. And when we were there in 2018, they had just finished these multi-thousand-acre burns right in the wildland urban interface. And it was right after the 416 fire, in the middle of a D4 drought, you know, kind of challenging conditions. And we wanted to know what they were doing. We also heard from the BLM state office that this was one place in the state where the BLM district, the Tres Rios district, was also working effectively on prescribed fire and in partnership with the National Forest. And so we kind of used this as an opportunity to look at both the National Forest and that BLM district. So I'll tell you just in brief, and you know, I recognize this is broad brush and there's nuance in here, but I want to tell you briefly what we heard about the San Juan. When I initially contacted them, people were immediately started talking about the importance of leadership. They essentially said, you know, our line officers are really on board with the importance of prescribed fire. They talked about how their staff officers were really supportive and really active in entering into a lot of agreements and partnerships to make this happen. And then they talked a lot about their partners. When I asked folks on this forest who I should interview, I got long lists of partners. And so they would point to their TREX partners, their Nature Conservancy prescribed fire training exchange partners. They would talk about their local wildland fire department. They talked about their state partners. You know, they pointed to the Chama Peak Land Alliance, all these partners in the area that they said were critical to getting their work done. And particularly, we heard a lot about their work with Mountain Studies Institute and agreements that they had in, you know, leading a lot of outreach and communication and coordination in that area. So it was really clear that that was a big factor on the San Juan, but also just dedication of individual FMOs and their passion for getting prescribed fire on the ground and finding ways over the many, many things that sort of need to be put in place to make prescribed fire happen. So that was a huge theme. We also heard about planning strategies. I think on the Columbine Ranger District, they were doing larger EAs, these kind of integrated veg management EAs, and talked a lot about the value of that for building agreement around how to move forward with prescribed fire and building strategy. But on the Dolores Ranger District, they were doing a district-wide EA to support prescribed fire. And so those kinds of district-wide environmental assessments and NEPA documents, I think, are things people are thinking about more and more. And they were really excited about the potential for that to clear a lot of acres for prescribed fire, and also to support management of natural ignitions during wildland fires. This forest also clearly had a pretty amazing outreach program. So we heard a lot about, air quality regulators told us this. They told us on the forest that they were working together, bringing people out to see what they were doing, to talk about the air quality challenges, to set up extra monitoring, to really tackle challenges around like ventilation ratings, but also really active outreach with the community. So that's where groups like Mountain Studies Institute came into play, and like leading local forums and other NGOs in the area, but also visits with members of the public, field trip with sensitive members of the public who might be sensitive to smoke. So a lot of investment in that outreach and communication. They were using some diverse authorities to make sure that they could use state and local capacity on their burn teams, and also the Wyden Amendment to work on private lands to some extent. And then they were also getting investment from the regional office to staff up a fuels program. And so I think there was a bit of a positive feedback loop there. Like, this forest is doing good work, let's invest in them more, and it's helping them build a strong program. Just to share with you some quotes of what people said. One person said, this is really speaking to that leadership issue. If you've got the right person with the right skill set and vision, they can have a huge impact on the program. That person is one of those people. He's always looking for opportunities. He recognizes the value of more prescribed fire in the landscape. So we heard this loud and clear, that like that individual commitment and passion makes a huge difference in terms of your prescribed fire program on a unit. One person said, we've really not left any stone unturned as far as our neighbors go, and then also engaging with people in the state, like the Colorado Department of Health and Environment and the smoke program or the air quality program. There was really active dialogue there that I think was really leading to some opportunities. And another person said, we're being proactive, we're collecting the data, we're trying to do the analysis. So they're talking about air quality regulators. See, we're not just asking for stuff, but we're also investing, trying to lead to better decision-making and better outcomes. And so this really spoke to kind of that proactive work around air quality monitoring and outreach. They also confirmed a lot of challenges we'd heard about on the San Juan. They said they were having resources diverted away from prescribed fire. And this is particularly a challenge because they told us some of their best burn windows are in August and September, really during the height of fire season. And so they will have a hard time getting capacity, especially when the nation's in preparedness level 4 or 5, getting hot shot crews. They might be around, but not made available for prescribed fire because they're kind of being held on reserve, or they're out on wildland fire somewhere. We also heard about the dearth of type 1 burn bosses, and that can make it challenging to have more complex prescriptions and burn plans. And then we also heard about challenges of maintaining workforce in the winter, and then again in the summer because of competition with wildland fire. We heard there are definitely some disincentives for prescribed burning, and so that can be things that people perceive around unequal pay, but also just the lack of rewards for sort of making the effort to do prescribed burning when there's a lot of other pressures in the agency to do other things and to kind of focus on maybe more short-term objectives. We also heard in some cases that land use priorities can be challenging. This can be an issue, for example, with managing for Gunnison sage grouse. Resource sharing was still a challenge. And then of course, as I mentioned, just the burn windows, especially when they coincide with fire season. So real quick overview of the San Juan. I feel like I can't do justice to all the interesting stuff I heard down there, but hopefully that gives you a sense of it. And I'm going to move on to the Sierra National Forest. Everyone we talked to in California said to go check out what was going on in the Sierra and just talk to them about what they were thinking about. I think that what we've realized, we're still looking at working with them to look at the data, but they're working to increase their burning, but don't have a lot of accomplishment growth to date. But I think have some really interesting things that they're trying to do that we can all learn from. Things that they told us on the Sierra National Forest. So for those of you who aren't familiar, this is basically east of Fresno in the mountains in California. And they talked about how collaborative activities at multiple levels were making a difference for them. So one thing we heard was that the Dinky CFLRP group had built some agreement around prescribed fire that was helpful, but that particularly folks from that group working at the state level and that state level collaboration in California was making a big difference. So there's been a governor's, task force around forest health. There's been a lot of investments in fuels reduction from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. CAL FIRE now has a lot more resources to do fuels reduction. And there's been direction, to the California Air Resources Board to really work to figure out how to support more prescribed fire. And so there's just a lot of state level momentum, and people talked a lot about that state level collaboration being really critical to overcome challenges, especially around prescribed fire, where there's state level forestry agencies that make a big difference and air quality regulatory agencies. The Sierra is also doing a forest-wide categorical exclusion for prescribed fire. People, I think some people were nervous about that. Some people were excited, but in general, what we heard was that could allow people to connect vegetation management projects with fire and really go where the opportunities are and create flexibility. But I think it did depend on some real trust with collaborators that had been built there. So that will be really interesting to watch. There's definitely some facilitative policies that are making a difference. They were applying for, like I said, CFLRP, but also Joint Chiefs funds, but also funds from the California Climate Change Initiative, the CCI, and under the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund to basically get money to do fuels work on the forest. Particularly the High Sierra Ranger District had an awesome collaboration going on with CAL FIRE and some really beneficial resource sharing plans. They've worked to really integrate their silviculture and fire management staff and seek grants together. I think that's been valuable. And then we also heard, and this is kind of a general theme of our work, that the local air quality district understands the need for prescribed fire and is working more actively with them, say compared to about a decade ago. And certainly we've heard that about the Air Resources Board as well. Ongoing challenges on the Sierra, huge issues with capacity. People said that basically their funds cover their fixed costs and that they have to go out and seek money to do work. And then having the capacity to do that, to do the planning, to do the archaeological, the wildlife clearances is a major issue. And then of course, to actually staff burn teams. That was a huge theme that came out on this forest. People said having consistent leadership direction from the regional office on down is really important to success. And when it wavers at all, that can be a big issue. On this forest and among partners, people talked about sometimes the challenges that can occur with diverse mandates between state and federal agencies or across land ownerships. There was a little bit of debate about the NEPA approach that I alluded to, but I don't think this was a major theme yet. We'll see how that plays out. And then people talked a little bit about challenges due still to some public resistance about smoke near their homes, challenges around protecting other resources. And then of course, you're familiar with the drought and extraordinary mortality event in California that I think has created some challenging fuel conditions. Some quotes about the Sierra. People said, I don't know how we would have made ends meet if we didn't have those two bigger grants, CCI and the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So I think having those sources of money from the state have made a huge difference there. One person said, I think the Forest Service needs to look at their overall capacity. We could think of the most amazing project. There's no way we could carry it out because we're so understaffed, and not just here as a forest, but as a region. We heard this across all of our interviews. And then this person said, I think the Air Pollution Control District, San Joaquin, understands that, and they know that it's pay now or pay later. We've got a good enough rapport to where they know we're not going to try and take advantage. And we understand that we're working with some guidelines and some constraints. And so this just speaks to that coordination between regulators and land managers that I think emerges loud and clear from all of our research about being so central to forward progress. So I'm going to pass things off now to Heidi to tell you about our other two case studies.
Thanks, Courtney. So I'm going to start by talking just a bit about like Courtney said, it's kind of hard to do these cases justice with the time that we have, but we're going to step quickly through the Socorro Field Office and the Albuquerque District BLM, which was the only BLM district that responded to our request for looking for places to do case studies where units are trying to increase application of prescribed fire. And then their neighboring forest, the Cibola National Forest, Magdalena's Ranger District, also works closely with them. So in this case, we were looking at both BLM and Forest Service land management units. And broadly, what I'm going to talk about are the facilitating factors and challenges that we saw across both those units. Prescribed fire in the Socorro Field Office area had increased in the early 2000s, but has stagnated in more recent years due to a lack of funding. And then the Magdalena Ranger District has had an active fire program with some pretty significant increases in their use of fire in the last decade or so. And then just another note here is that both units engage in prescribed fire as well as managing naturally ignited fires for resource benefits. So a few facilitating factors for these agencies is they have particularly high coordination among agencies, both federal agencies and state agencies, through informal and formal agreements with BLM, Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife. New Mexico Game and Fish has been a really key partner for funding and resources when a lot of burning for wildlife benefit, as well as New Mexico State Forestry Division. And that's the kind of the key ways that they're sharing workforce and equipment. And then another kind of unique thing that's going on here is the forest supervisors on the Cibola, Santa Fe, and Carson National Forests have made an agreement called the Tri-Fi to pool their resources and targets to try to accomplish more burning. There's creative ways that folks are finding to get funding and resources to get this work done, engaging what's called the All Hands, All Lands Burn Team, AmeriCorps, VetCorps, as well as all women's and Forest Stewards Guild crews to do some of this burning. The New Mexico legislature has funded mechanical thinning and prescribed burning work on federal lands in the state for almost a decade, which has been another source of funding and support for this work. And then a lot of these folks are also using training experiences like TREX to increase workforce capacity and skills, while also getting on the ground burning done. Northern New Mexico also has a fairly long fire season, low population densities, and strong public awareness, and generally support for using fire as compared to some of our other cases. So all of these have been kind of facilitating factors for the region. Next slide, please. And so then some challenges that we're seeing in this case is, like very similar to what Courtney's been talking about, insufficient funding and agency staff to support prescribed burning. And in this case, particularly for resource specialists, contracts and agreement staff, and then dedicated fuel staff. And then the other disincentives to burn that people mentioned were not offering hazard pay to agency employees working on burns, and existing policies making it risky for individuals to burn. Burn permits in general are inhibited here quite strongly by threatened and endangered species regulations, more so than air quality restrictions. Sage grouse and Mexican spotted owl in particular have absorbed resources as far as resources are going to that and away from burn programs. Some of those restrictions have limited when and where burning can occur, and in some cases have resulted in litigation that's halted work on units. And so then going on to some quotes from people, what we heard is, one is this, kind of this idea about, we stand around looking at the great burn windows and meanwhile all our firefighters are in California. One of the challenges that people talked about is when they do actually have burn windows available, most of the resources that they would need to use are actually elsewhere fighting fires. And then secondly, another person talked about the need, this really strong need that they have in the area to develop and formalize resource sharing agreements among both agencies and with partners, talking about it just takes a ton of time to get agreements on even very simple things. And that's been frustrating to both agency managers, as well as the partners that would like to assist. And then finally, another person talked about this kind of idea of the unique cross-agency coordination that happens in New Mexico. There's a really strong community for partnerships in New Mexico as well, across agencies and across disciplines. We're lucky that the state forestry and wildlife professionals can link up with the Forest Service or with the state land office and work cross-boundary, and that's another unique thing that we have in New Mexico. So that's kind of our whirlwind tour through New Mexico. And then moving on to Oregon, the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest is, we selected this case due to some of the collaborations in recent years that have increased where they're burning as well as the amount that they're burning. This forest had a robust burn program for years, but has recently actually been scaled down. And so really what we're talking about here is burning critical acres or kind of more specific acres, not necessarily a higher number of acres overall. The challenges in this case were a little bit different than our other cases. Specifically, workforce capacity is not a key issue, and smoke management is a primary constraint. So this goes back to what Courtney was saying about our phase 1 findings of the Pacific Northwest having smoke management plans that did limit some of the burning. So to start, some of the facilitating factors in this case, the kind of the key one is that on the Siskiyou Mountains Ranger District, which is the main focus of this work, that particular ranger district is part of the Ashland Forest Resiliency Project, which is a partnership between federal, state, city, and private resources to complete landscape scale cross-boundary work in the Ashland watershed with a focus on hazardous fuels reduction. The AFR has used a lot of innovative and creative approaches to burning, They do a lot of cross-boundary work. They focus a lot on increasing community buy-in, and they do a lot of work around kind of sharing roles, responsibilities, and resources. So even if they're not burning across boundaries, they're coordinating across boundaries in a way to align their work plans. And people talked about some of the other things related to AFR that have been really important for the area, such as early and sustained program funding has been really key. The continuity of the people and the organizations at the table, the increasing levels of trust between partners in the community through the outreach work that's gone on, as well as some of the kind of the nuts and bolts of weekly partner meetings and having the right folks at the table. And then the one other thing that's kind of a key facilitating factor for this area is that trained workforce capacity is not a main challenge for this area. Southern Oregon is one of the most concentrated regions of fire suppression contractors, as well as hand crews and equipment, particularly private businesses. And so the forest often uses, and actually the BLM units there too, often use contractors to conduct prescribed burning. And those contractors have trained crews and burn bosses. So even though workforce is not a primary constraint as far as capacity in the area, it still can be a challenge for the area because the agencies might not actually have the funds available to hire contractors to do the amount of burning they need to do. And so then going on to the challenges, a lot of the challenges that we heard at the Ashland level were consistent with what we heard in the phase 1 work around Oregon and the challenges that Oregon faces. But, you know, like we just talked about, lack of funding and agency capacity were really key barriers on the forest. And people also talked about how the funding sources they are able to obtain often prioritize new projects rather than a lot of the maintenance work that is needed. And then people also talked about turnover as a drain on the forest, particularly in fire staff. Other administrative issues such as having enough certified and trained personnel that can sign off on burn plans and other burning admin paperwork such as that was a limitation. Also, burdensome and limited windows for hiring. Some of their training seems to occur during their best burn windows, so staff are off the forest. And sometimes their funding that could support forest burning comes too late in the year for their actual fire season. And then really probably one of the key issues here is that Ashland is designated as a smoke sensitive receptor area in SSRA, which means that it has a highest level of protection under Oregon's smoke management plan. So securing burn permits under the smoke management plan has historically been a challenge for the forest and particularly the Ashland area, which is a kind of collects all the smoke from the valley. And so this has been changing a bit with burners in the area working with the Oregon Department of Forestry to increase the number of allowable burn days, as well as some revisions that took place to the smoke management plan last year. But this is still a key challenge that people are navigating. And then also leadership support and risk aversion were noted as barriers. Some kind of particularly contentious issues that people did not agree on included some decisions around not burning more than was necessary to meet forest targets, not burning during the state declared fire season, so no prescribed burning during the months that Oregon Department of Forestry declared as the fire season, and then suppressing all naturally ignited wildfires immediately. And then finally, another challenge is low public tolerance for fire impacts has hindered some of the prescribed fire work, particularly because a lot of these areas for prescribed burning are really close to town or homes. And so some of the recent work that AFR has done around outreach, a program they have called Smokewise Ashland and other things like that have helped improve some of those challenges. Next slide, please. So in people's own words, you know, this idea of challenges of tolerance for smoke in this area really comes from a lot of people in this area. It's been socked in with smoke for the last couple of years, and so from wildfire smoke, and so having to go through that and then having to have prescribed burning smoke is really too much for some, for understandable reasons. And so in this person says, when you have a very aggressive large wildfire season, people want to take a breath literally with clean air before they get hit with prescribed burning smoke. And then another individual talked about, kind of what's unique about AFR. It's a different business model that we're using than on the rest of the forest because of the ecological and social political situation that we have in the Ashland community specifically. And then finally, another individual talked about how the early years of AFR was really limited by approval from the state for smoke, but how that's really changed. We have much more flexibility on borderline days to light a few piles, test, and see how we're doing. It's really much more of an adaptive management style, and how that took some relationship building and trust to get there. And then I'll just note at the bottom, this is a screenshot, maybe a little bit cut off, but this is part of the Smokewise Ashland program around alerting people around burns, smoke in the area, providing resources for smoke-sensitive individuals, et cetera. So really part of a massive amount of outreach and communication the region has done. Next slide, please. So just transitioning now to the cross-case themes. The cross-case challenges, so across all these case studies, some of the things that we noted that were really the key challenges and facilitating factors really aligned with what we heard in our phase 1 work, but with a lot more local and kind of specific examples. So the most common theme, of course, was the lack of funding and trained workforce capacity available to actually plan and conduct prescribed burning. And another challenge was around a lack of strong incentives or support for leaders or others to focus on prescribed fire. Interviewees thought the agency priorities were really focused on wildfire suppression and timber targets, often at the expense of prescribed firework. And again, this idea that the fuels treatment dollars that were available were prioritized for new projects rather than maintenance work that was needed. Outreach and communication challenges between the agency and the general public were an ongoing challenge as well. Staffing gaps creating administrative bottlenecks on forests, specifically a lack of agency staff to help with planning, conducting wildlife and archaeological clearances, working on grants and agreements to make partnerships and leverage resources, as well as administrative capacity for hiring personnel were some of the big ones we heard. We also heard about a lot of locally specific challenges around topography, timing of burn windows, state level smoke regulations, species protection, and public tolerance of smoke impacts. Next slide, please. And then looking at some of the facilitators that we saw across these themes, some of the key ones that I'm going to talk through here quickly are, around leadership and commitment from line officers, staff, and partners, effective and strategic planning strategies, partnerships, as well as collaboration and communication strategies. Next slide. So on cross-case themes around leadership and personnel commitment, interviewees really often when we interviewed them really named individual fuels program staff, planners, or fire management officers as the reason that their area was able to overcome some burning challenge. So it's really about those individuals like Courtney had noted. And they also noted that that really also depends on leadership supporting those staff as well. These individuals were described as doing things such as providing general support for staff activities around burning, seeking out partnership opportunities, working on agreements, planning, and clearances, and supporting creative staffing and planning approaches. People also talked about how support outside the local level is important. So the regional office, partner commitments, state partners, and NGO collaborators, having that support was really key to getting their burning done. And again, like one individual describes here, it's really about those individuals that are leading the effort. The biggest takeaway I have is having good people around me that are motivated to do prescribed fire. Next slide, please. And then on partnerships, partners were noted as critical, particularly in times of limited capacity, which all these places are facing. Interviewees talked about the importance of sharing trained workforces through formal or informal agreements, as well as resource sharing partnerships, a lot of which we heard about were specific examples of how that was done through federal and state land management agencies. Staffing from partners was also critical, particularly using NGOs and contractors, trained personnel to staff burn teams. Partnerships were also really important for leveraging capacity to conduct outreach with landowners. People talked about how different partners had rapport with different sectors of the public, and those broad partnerships really helped in their outreach and helped them engage different audiences. And then in addition, using partners to accomplish burning work really requires multiple approaches. And so some of the things that people talked about were the use of different arrangements and authorities. So the use of CFLRP and good neighbor authority to burn across boundaries and possibly at larger scales. And the use of TREC's prescribed fire training exchanges to train up workforce capacity while also accomplishing burned acres in local areas. Next slide, please. And so then we also heard consistently about collaboration and communication, specifically that land managers and air quality regulators should really work closely together to identify and take advantage of the opportunities there are to burn. And when air quality regulation is a constraint, having really strong collaborative relationships between regulators and local units is an important component to success. Units also talked about the need to make an extra effort to conduct public outreach in order to grow their programs. So using partners like NGOs to engage members of the public who are concerned about burning or who might be impacted about it. They talked about the use of personal visits, social media, traditional news outlets, tours, and talks to really help increase the public outreach and understanding behind prescribed fire. Also, like we just talked about with Smokewise Ashland and some of the work in New Mexico around providing air filters to vulnerable populations. All of this communication around what burning's occurring and advertising planned burns and what the conditions might be were really helpful. And then, kind of this growing understanding of prescribed fire and the need for it as we have kind of increasingly intense wildfire seasons, people are understanding that prescribed fire is an important tool in the toolbox, like this quote down here says. Next slide, please. And then finally on, this idea of planning. Planning was a theme that ran throughout our interviews. Successful burn programs really rely on planning strategies that can increase both their efficiency and flexibility. So this is, includes the importance of burning as part of forest plans, as well as landscape and project level NEPA approaches, as well as having strategies within plans to ensure resource availability and having flexible burn plans. So some forests thought doing district or forest-wide planning documents would bring efficiencies for planning and clearance, and that it could allow them to conduct more burning without being constrained by project boundaries. And other people talked about facilitating this application of naturally ignited fire, burning under appropriate conditions, and that being an increasing part of their burn program. We heard that particularly in New Mexico. And then I think, the last comment there to get into Courtney's wrap up here is that planning approaches raise some considerations around the trade-offs between developing and planning ahead for coherent strategies on these units, but at the same time, the trade-off of not having those opportunities to build new partnerships through the planning process. So I'm going to stop there and hand it over to Courtney to wrap up.
Thanks, Heidi. I'll just wrap up here with a few recommendations and reflections that we've come up with. So recommendations, and these are really, based on what we heard from people in the field that we talked to, but what we heard was that prescribed fire needs to really be a consistent priority from policymakers at the national level all the way on down through the organizations for it to really be applied successfully and for programs to really grow. And that people said that they need to have dedicated prescribed fire staff with equal pay incentives to be working on prescribed fire and not to go on wildland fire. And there's a lot of reasons why people said that they need dedicated crews, but people talked about having, potentially a little more flexibility to call on resources that were available, more like a resource ordering system for prescribed fire, but actually having maybe rotating crews within areas or regions that could be dedicated to prescribed fire and not get pulled onto wildland fire. And I think that was a huge thing we heard. We also heard a need for augmenting resources, whether or not that comes from the state or the federal government. I think that's going to be a big issue. And when people talked about that, they talked about it not just to the federal government, but also, for partnerships and collaborations in areas to actually be able to secure funding to move forward on a kind of a co-created vision. And then we've heard consistently about the need to streamline and improve agreement mechanisms. So everything from being able to share resources between DOI and USDA at the national level to more efficient approaches to agreements at the local level. And we'd be happy to chat about that if that's something folks are interested in. We definitely heard about the need to consistently invest in monitoring and smoke communication, and that this needs to be a skill and capacity that is really associated with doing prescribed fire, like is becoming, I think, more kind of normalized in the wildland fire context. People really emphasize that this is something that needs to be a big part of the job in doing prescribed fire. Continuing to build partnerships with regulators and NGO partners really seems to be a key part of the puzzle. And then we heard consistently that risk aversion is an ongoing challenge. And I think this is, for me, from a policy perspective, pretty interesting, because there are things that people will naturally do, and they tend to focus on like measurable short-term goals that are gonna yield rewards. And when we think about prescribed fire as sort of a process to kind of work against kind of the long-term risk of fire, and that there are a lot of short-term challenges and barriers, that's where we would really think we need active policy and incentives to support it and promote it, or it's going to be difficult to have it happen. The only times it would happen where you have like personal commitment to making it happen. And so I think this is something we all need to think about, is how do we really kind of change the calculus and invest now to really prevent like long-term financial and, you know, social and ecological costs that are coming with the way that we approach fire management right now. Some reflections I wanted to finish with, you know, we recognize that we're finding that capacity is emerging as the most prevalent challenge. And we know that there are some places where air quality regulation is still a significant barrier, or maybe people will still point to NEPA, but what we hear most consistently is that capacity is an issue. And when we think about why that might be, I think there's a few reasons. And one is because the federal land management agencies have lost a tremendous amount of land management capacity over the last 20 years. So since the last surveys were done, there's been some major changes in just the amount of staff and funding that's available. I think the other thing is that there's just a broader agreement about the importance of prescribed fire, and there seems to be a lot more active collaboration between regulators and land managers. And so I think when we talk to people about what's really getting in their way, you know, even in states where there's a lot of complexity and challenges, like California, people will say in the end, it's really capacity that's their biggest challenge right now. And they think that there's probably quite a bit of room in policy if they had the capacity to, you know, to move forward. In terms of how we address that, I think that's the real conundrum is, you know, how do we maybe create state and local burn teams, but then how do we really address the capacity limitations and prioritize resources within the federal government? I think that's a big issue that we're all going to need to tackle. The other thing I wanted to emphasize is that there really is no silver bullet policy fix that we find, and we just wouldn't expect that. We would expect a lot of variability and complexity across locations. And so that implies that we have to have that collaborative problem solving at the local and the state level to kind of figure out what are the challenges at each of those levels and how do we overcome them. And that's just because you're always going to have different, you know, land conditions, different partners, you know, different sort of social organizational challenges at all those different levels. And so I think that's part of the reason the collaboration and communication at multiple levels is so critical. That just kind of gets at the fact that across all of environmental management, we're seeing the need to work across sectors and really leverage like the comparative advantage that happens at different governance levels. So from like the local to the state to the national, that's what I'm referring to when I talk about multi-level consideration. So just thinking that's kind of the way we need to be doing business going forward. And all this said, I mean, I think we found a lot of things about where there's room to move forward and what some of the most pressing challenges are, but we also do hear from people to really burn at a landscape scale, do multi-day burning overnight with more uncertainty. There's going to be a lot of issues there that are going to present challenges. You know, some people are concerned if the, what it will mean when PM 2.5 standards change and how they'll navigate that. And then of course, how all of this is going to interplay with the fact that we expect significantly more wildland fire, which is going to exacerbate a number of the problems we talked about. So I think there's some good potential movement forward, but we certainly have, you know, a difficult road to hoe going forward as well. So with that, we will stop and take some questions. And I just want to take a moment to say, sorry, you all can't see this the way it's formatted, but thank you for joining us, and again for taking interest in our work, and a really sincere thank you to everybody who takes time to talk with us over and over and help us understand what's going on in the field so that we can synthesize it. And thanks to the Joint Fire Science Program for funding. And I would just encourage you to go to this University of Oregon website, and that cutoff piece says publications, and you can find all of our reports there. There's also a projects page there that has all of our stuff from this project. So with that, I'm going to try to minimize this and turn it over to Gloria to help us facilitate some Q&A.
Hi, thanks, Courtney. That was a fabulous presentation. We had a lot of really interesting comments. Just to double check my sound, if people can post in chat to make sure that they can hear me. And I'd like to, since we could be getting a lot of comments in chat, I'd like to address some of those questions first, and then we can move to the Q&A because won't get as buried in comments. So Courtney and Heidi, you had some really good questions. The first question in chat was, there's a lot about convincing air quality and forestry people to do more prescribed fire burning, but only about 50% of the acres approved annually for burning west-wide are actually accomplished. How are the prescribed fire program folks taking responsibility for accomplishing the requested improved levels. And I believe, to clarify what they're asking is, it seems like a lot of the responsibility is put on air quality and forestry people. How much is really put on the prescribed fire program managers to accomplish?
Well, I could try to take a stab at that. I think that depends on the region and leadership, but my sense is that, you know, a tremendous amount of responsibility is put on the fuels program to accomplish those acres. And I think on a lot of units, people are working in a pretty integrated fashion. So they're, you know, trying to figure out together how they're going to do the vegetation management and, you know, pool resources around fuels acres and meeting accomplishments. And in some regions, there's more emphasis on that than others. And I think, you know, the other thing that I would say we've noticed is that fuels program managers themselves tend to be incredibly dedicated to getting this work done. And we're seeing some creative strategies lately. So I know, for example, in California, they're collecting more data you know, across the region to try to understand when there are days that are a go from an air quality perspective, why or why not, you know, people are burning and what the barriers are. And a lot of people are participating in these collaborative forums to do that problem solving. And so I think that that responsibility is there. I can also say that I've seen cases where there are people in fuels positions that are pretty risk averse and not necessarily, you know, taking the challenge head on. And you know, I think that does make a huge difference in these programs. Heidi, is there anything that you would add there?
No, I don't have anything. Anna, would you want to add anything to that?
Annie, you might want to unmute yourself.
Hi. Nope, that's great.
Okay, I'm going to move along because we just have a few more minutes and a lot of questions. And I'd like to state, first of all, thank you for our international guests for joining us. You might be in the early morning or midnight hours. We have attendees from Portugal, Australia, and other countries joining us. So some of the questions might be a little unique. So thank you for joining us. One question is, how are fuel reductions from accomplished prescribed burning translated into updated fuel layers used by wildfire managers? Isn't collecting and transmitting those data the responsibility of prescribed fire managers? One tool that I'm going to toss in, one tool that a lot of people use is Landfire, which is run by the Nature Conservancy. What can you tell us about that?
Not much, Gloria. That is outside of my area of expertise.
Yeah, I believe a lot of it, there's a variety of mapping sources through the US Geological Survey, specifically by biophysical data loaded by Landfire. And if you're still interested, we might be able to get you some more. This is from Tom Moore. You can contact us later. We can try to get you some more information on that. Another question is, one question about the cost of prescribed fires. Have you estimated the average cost of applying prescribed fire per acre? And I know that data is out there, but I don't know if it's part of this study.
Yeah, that has not been part of our project, but I do think that there's some good information out there about the cost of it, and then people who have also worked on looking at the averted costs related with fire suppression that accrue during, you know, due to fuel reduction activities, but also not, you know, not really a piece of our project.
Okay, you can stay in touch. The person who asked that, you can also stay in touch with your regional fire science consortium or network, and we can try to get you that information. Courtney, Heidi, and Anna, do you have any insight into the recent Bureau of Land Management statement of doubling or quote unquote near tripling of acres treated this year above goals? Not sure if they're prescribed or mechanical acres, but just due to the normal reporting process, it seems unlikely.
Wow, that's not something I've heard, and I would love if there are any BLM colleagues on who could help us learn more about that. If you'd shoot me a line and we could talk about it. It's not something I'm familiar with.
Right. Luis from Portugal is asking, do you see any difference between burning tree stands and shrubland? And Luis, I don't mean to speak for Courtney at all, And I'm just going to pop in and say, yes, I can say that there's substantial difference between tree stands and shrubland, and we can point you towards some fire specialists if you're interested in more.
Yep, I don't have a lot to add there, Gloria. I mean, it's something that we talk about peripherally with interviews, but again, not like a core part of what we're talking to folks about.
Okay. Here is more of a personnel question from Nick Goulet. You mentioned, did you learn anything about the responsibility that fire personnel and leadership feel to get prescribed fire on the ground? This disconnected responsibility between fuels and fire personnel, not sharing targets and budgets, seems to be a barrier towards mobilizing the capacity.
I missed a little bit of that question, but I think I got it. Let me know if I'm off target when I'm done. But, you know, I would say that that is better aligned in some regions than others. And so we hear, particularly in Region 3, people feel like there's a lot of alignment among staff areas about what they're doing and what their approach is going to be meeting their targets. I do think, you know, that under the current administration, the emphasis has been more on meeting timber targets and also on moving forward with shared stewardship in terms of identifying priority areas. And so I think that, you know, this is one of the big challenges, is that people's energy will get directed in different places. And sometimes, like, there are places where, you know, people tell us that their fuels reduction activities really nicely overlap with where they would go for meeting timber volume targets, or that there's really like there's not a lot of separation between what they would do for one or the other. And there are other places where there are big differences. And so I think that there are line officers I've talked to said that the timber target will lead them away from their focus on prescribed fire or on fuels reduction, or, you know, working towards resilient lands and communities related to fire management. And so I think that that's a big challenge, is that the incentives that are coming down to the Forest Service, and then sometimes coming from state partners or even state delegations, can make a huge difference in different locations. And so that sort of goes back to what we were saying, that having prescribed fire be a really clear policy priority from like the national level on down, I think is going to be a prerequisite for really making a big difference. Otherwise, we're going to be relying on the creativity and passion of local places, and people will be able to make some incremental improvement, but it's going to take political leadership at the state and the national level to make a difference.
Okay, thanks, Courtney. We're getting tons of questions, and I'd like to remind the audience that all these questions will be recorded, and we can try to answer some of these after the webinar is over. Our time is almost up. And Courtney, I'd like to just tag on to your last comments. Jesse Duncrack asks, any chance for a deeper dive into federal legislative barriers where funding, priorities, and capacity originate?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there is some potential leadership on prescribed fire at the federal level, and potentially thinking about new legislation. And when that happens, I think it's going to take a crew of people talking to their legislators, you know, and to their staff to really understand like what the challenges are and what the debates look like, and then how we overcome them. But you know, in terms of a deeper dive on our part, we do some of that policy outreach and communication with policymakers to kind of understand what some of their concerns are. And I actually think that I'm hopeful we might see some positive forward movement at the national level. And then of course at the state level, I think it varies. But I think there's some really exciting new ideas out there around prescribed fire. People have been really listening to our work, and a lot of other people have been saying like, hey, we need to make a big difference on this. And I think we might see some good stuff in the next year or two.
Okay, great, thanks. The rest of you, I'm really sorry. I think we're running out of time for the questions just keep coming in, which is not a surprise. I just have a couple of notes before our speakers wind up. Thanks to all the cooperators for sponsoring and presenting this important research. Continuing education credits are available through the Society of American Foresters, but you must email gloria.edwards@colostate.edu. My email is posted in chat. And your attendance will be verified through our records. Please be sure to answer our feedback survey. After the webinar is over, you'll be sent a feedback survey. This helps us greatly in our reporting and our performance, as well as our funding. The video recording of this webinar will be available on the Northwest Fire Science Consortium and linked through the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network. And I believe with that, that brings us right to 3 o'clock. Speakers, do you have time for any more questions?
This is Heidi. I would just add that I've answered some of the questions in the Q&A box, and if folks didn't get their questions answered, please do follow up and we're happy to chat more about them.
Great.
Yes, likewise, I think we've got to call it off at 3, and I haven't been able to see the questions because I'm not sure what's going on with my screen, but again, thanks to everybody, and like Heidi said, feel free to be in touch with us.
Okay, we'll make sure that we get the questions, all these questions recorded in our post-webinar report. We'll get all of these to the speakers and have them contact you. There's some really great ones. Thank you, researchers. And we're hoping that this leads us into a new era of prescribed fire organization and accomplishment. Thank you very much. That concludes our webinar. And don't forget to support your Joint Fire Science program and your regional universities.